Shimoneta, A Boring World Where the Concept of Dirty Jokes Doesn't Exist, was a surprisingly prescient anime and actually pretty well written if you can get past all of the dirty jokes and satire. The show itself is really absurd. It's about a dystopian future where Japan has banned anything that they deem immoral, including dirty language, pornography, anything sexual. It's actually pretty dystopian, where they have dirty joke terrorists and people spreading out things like porn or condoms or anything lewd makes you a terrorist. And something that's really interesting, because the books are only 10, 15 years old roughly, since it's a series, I'm assuming it was a critique of the more conservative aspects of Japanese culture at the time. And it's unfortunately incredibly appropriate commentary on the Western world now. And depending on what country you're in, it seems to be from the progressive side in some aspects. You still have some of your boomer theocrats on the right-wing side. And the fact that it's relevant at all is kind of depressing in its own right. The show being so over the top makes it have a kind of juvenile sense of humor and style, but the actual writing and characters and story of the show I think are pretty good. So it leads to a pretty fun show overall, even though it's a bummer that it's relevant today. For people who don't know, in Britain, they're trying to make you scan your ID to look at the internet and anything they consider adult content. People have been trolling this, using their prime minister's face as their ID scan, VPNs obviously, but the fact that the effort is there at all is insane. For the Americans, you've had some of your more boomer types mention things like getting rid of anonymity on the internet. Some states have tried to ban Pornhub. This is the more like religious right, as far as I can tell. From the progressive left, or your sort of anti-sex feminist, or whatever they want to call themselves, you'll see things like making every single woman androgynous looking. They all have this dumbass shaved head haircut. You'll see in the video game industry, they're making all the women masculine. Even games like Mortal Kombat that I like, all of the clothes cover up way more of the women. You see people pushing back on fan service and anime. You'll see actresses that got famous, largely in part to being sexy, grow to resent this over time as they get older. People like Scarlett Johansson, who suddenly regret that they were viewed sexually as Black Widow, conveniently when they start to age out of their sexual prime, even though they're obviously still attractive. I don't see them giving any of the money back that they made, exploiting their own sexuality. Probably seen Sydney Sweeney get a lot of love for her boobs and actually embracing the fact that she has giant knockers, while the anti-sex progressive crowd calls her a fucking Nazi, and all sorts of insanity that just go on in culture war bullshit. Personally, I think Sydney Sweeney is a butterface, and if she started talking like Rachel Zegler, all the right-wing culture war people that are talking about how much they like her would be calling her Sid the Sloth with tits. Whatever. She seems chill by celebrity standards. I'm going to give a quick plot synopsis so I can talk about the things I think the show does well and you have context. The main girl is Ayame. She's a dirty joke terrorist called Blue Snow, and she wears panties on her head, tries to distribute porn, and kind of fight back against the oppressive system that's in place in both society and in their school specifically, where they rank the schools based on their purity and morality. She blackmails Tanukichi, who's the son of a famous dirty joke terrorist who gave out condoms, publicly got arrested, and he's come to this school to try to be with his crush, who he puts on a pedestal because she's so pure, and I'm going to destroy her name. It's Anna Nishiki no Miya. There we go, that one's better, or closer at least. And their goal is just to give kids information, give them lewd materials, wake them up to the nature of humanity, and just kind of making sexuality more normal and giving people knowledge about it. They recruit this little girl on the right, Saltome, for her artistic ability. They get her to draw all kinds of lewd shit that they can give out. Everything is monitored in this world. Speech, what they're looking at, even the hand movements for drawing. So their artist has to find different ways to draw things. You could say creative ways to make them sexual. For instance, you could say you were drawing an elephant head and obviously turn that into a cock. And throughout the course of the season, the PMs and the government agencies are trying to crack down on this school because they figured out that Blue Snow seems to have ties to it. Anna has a sexual awakening and she misconstrues lust for Tanukichi with love because she has no education on it and just doesn't understand what the feelings are supposed to be. She's like a full-blown yandere about halfway through the season, and there's some really over-the-top jokes that I'm surprised they got away with, frankly, regarding her in particular. But throughout the season, Ayame and Tanukichi are pushing back, and you actually end up getting kind of a parallel to what we see from Xavier and Magneto and X-Men, where you have Ayame who wants peaceful protest and giving out information and knowledge to fight back. And there are other terrorist groups that are more violent and want to use more extreme means and physical attacks to try to force the world into agreeing with them. And everything is covered on the skin in these super over-the-top jokes and really immature sense of humor, these ridiculously disgusting fetishes. But I think it works because the characters in the show take it seriously. Ayame is very concerned that there's a violent faction that's going to get lumped in with them because that'll give the government more support and freedom to really crack down on their peaceful protest. So then you end up with factions who are both rebelling against the government, fighting against each other as well, because there's a very fundamental disagreement in philosophy. And the season comes to a head with Blue Snow and Ayame taking care of the other terrorist factions that are more extreme, and also getting a look at some actual history that's been hidden just because the art was viewed in a way that could possibly be interpreted as lewd or sexual and immoral. A lot of it would be kind of the equivalent of if you viewed like the statue of David in a sexual manner. It's just really out of control, purity spiraling. And even though the light novels go on after the show ends with Blue Snow and Tanukichi getting rid of the extreme faction. He realizes that he has feelings for her and that Anna, who he had put up on a pedestal, wasn't what he had idealized her to be. And they're in the process of continuing to push back against an oppressive society. So the show does a lot of things that I think work really well when they're taken seriously. And the show being so over the top, I think kind of hurts that and probably makes a lot of people distracted by all the penis jokes to appreciate that it actually is a competently told story. I think the world building is pretty cool, that they essentially want everybody to stop being a bunch of porn addicts. They allowed only digital porn to exist and got rid of all the physical versions of it. And then as soon as they felt like they had gotten rid of enough of it, they deleted access and all of the digital versions and started arresting anyone who looked at it, and they could track everyone. And obviously not to the same degree, but we've already seen this sort of thing with the streaming services. There's a lot less physical versions of media now, and you'll get trigger warnings on old movies. They'll edit little scenes out that are not sensible for modern taste. So it hasn't extended to porn yet. Realistically, it's only because they haven't found a way to do it logistically. Obviously, the government and just busybodies in general will regulate everything they're fucking capable of regulating. And I think this show does a great job of that. They have entire government agencies dedicated to this cause. The schools indoctrinate everyone to think this way. They conceal information and knowledge that would allow them to expand what they know into areas that they deem immoral. These are obviously things that happen all the time now. When you have super ideologically motivated teachers, what they choose to discuss and cover is your own form of kind of brainwashing and culture and dictating what the next generation believes. I'm not going to go into a huge rabbit hole on this, but for example, a lot of public schools will deeply cover World War II, fascism, Nazism, the Confederacy in America, and slavery, all things that should be covered, but they'll very conveniently neglect any kind of discussion around the USSR, around communism, things like the Holodomor. I'm not even sure how many younger kids are aware of things like Cambodia and how Pol Pot killed a quarter of the population there. And you could obviously expand this into the media in general. Hollywood is obviously very left-wing. A lot of mainstream news is generally left-wing. And this show really exemplifies all of these aspects of society and how these tools of knowledge and education can be weaponized to deliberately create ignorance in certain areas and cultivate thoughts and culture that you want to by omitting certain information. Something else the show does that I think is pretty relevant is they send in prefects to observe and report and just keep an eye on everyone. They essentially have people everywhere that will be tattletales and report to the government to shut down any ideology or conversations they don't like. And obviously this show, because it's so over the top, takes it to a crazy degree where she calls toilet paper a sexual thing because it's circular with a hole in it. But I think that's a really good way of showing a dystopian society. If you're familiar with 1984, that entire society, that's obviously a much more serious and dark dystopian book, functions in the same way where everyone is kind of a cop for the government. So the government can't be everywhere, but by enlisting the people and getting their cooperation, it overruns society with fear and it forces everyone to comply anyway. This is something, if you work at a corporation, you've probably observed yourself, where you go through orientation, they tell you every conversation you could ever have is offensive, and then because you have to worry about your income and your own life stability and providing for yourself and your family, everyone is forced to comply with this super sterilized corporate culture. And they do flat out say things like, if you see something, say something. They'll tell you stories about how if you observe behavior that's inappropriate and don't report it, you're just as accountable. So it really breeds this environment of everyone watching everyone all the time. Another thing I really think the show does well is Anna's arc of being this super pure girl, making her vulnerable to corruption because she doesn't understand it, I think is also super realistic. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the stereotype about Catholic schoolgirls going off and going to college and going crazy, or going to high school and going crazy and turning into big whores because they're just being oppressed and restricted their entire lives. And again, this show takes it up to 11, where she has like a super nose and she's trying to smell Tanukichi's underwear, and she's willing to hurt any girl that he associates with that's not her. But I think the point that the show is making is still valid, that when you oppress people like this and they don't understand things, they can become more dangerous to themselves and people around them due to their ignorance. And her character, while disturbingly seeming to be a fan favorite, I think really nails that point home. And I think she's a pretty funny but effective way to demonstrate kind of the failures of keeping people ignorant. A very relatable thing the show does already is the way they get around the systems in place. I mentioned they have the girl do art in weird ways that don't seem sexual based on hand motions, but they are. They use a lot of words that are similar to vulgar words and you know what they mean without saying them. Ayame has a phone that blocks her voice collar thing for a couple minutes each day, where she can just let out whatever she wants to say. These are all things that parallel the internet already. We've seen a lot of censorship in big tech with YouTube and Twitter previously, Reddit still to some degree, even though they seem to get away with it for whatever reason, where people will say things like kill yourself in Minecraft, or they'll say things like PDF file instead of pedophile. And I'm sure you've seen all kinds of these workarounds yourself. People use asterisk in place of vowels, or they'll say grape instead of rape, and on and on and on. While it's done in a ridiculous fashion in this show, the point that people will always find workarounds to communicate what they want. You can't stop thoughts, you can't stop ideas. I think the show does a good job of demonstrating that throughout, where you have them finding creative ways to draw porn, where they try to justify things under technicalities, like it's not porn, it's romance, where they try to describe things as anatomy or information instead of just sexual. And this whole rigmarole takes place just over and over throughout the season. But it is how the real world functions, it's how people operate. And the show does a really good job of just nailing a lot of these elements that apply to the real world, even though it's under a ridiculous mask. A very human thing that Tanukichi goes through is his entire romance with Anna is predicated on his idea of what she is, of how pure she is. Her mom is very high up in the morality wing of the government, and he envisions her as kind of this super pure girl. It seems like a way to compensate for his own background because he's ashamed of his dirty joke terrorist dad. And I think it's a really effective way of showing kind of the flaw of this worldview in general. Although I personally think guys are probably more guilty of this than girls, where you envision someone as this really pure, kind of infallible entity. At the end of the day, they're just people. And it also causes him to have kind of an identity crisis because his entire identity was only escaping from his father's image while being forced to join a terrorist organization that plays directly into the thing that he was trying to avoid becoming. And even at the end, they do have a nice serious moment where he asks who he is. And Ayame says that's something you have to figure out for yourself. And for what the show is, I think it's a really good character way to demonstrate that you can't just base your identity on what you don't want to be. You have to figure out what you do want and goals that you do have you want to accomplish and what will make you content. And there's also the hard lesson there of envisioning your future one way, but then reality changing what you actually want to become, what you do, who you associate with, all those things that you learn throughout life. And for it only being 12 episodes of ridiculous satire, I think the show fits that in pretty well. For Tanukichi in particular, the other characters have similar arcs to a lesser degree though. I'm not going to keep going on about it. At the end of the day, I think the show is pretty well written, even though the reputation of it seems to be just goofy, over-sexualized penis and vagina joke show. I think it actually nails all the fundamental parts of storytelling, and especially a dystopian story like this that could have easily been an incredibly dark show or premise, but it takes it and is able to make light of it while still getting serious points to come through under all the shenanigans on the surface. And more broadly speaking, I think it's really nice to see a dystopian story that you can actually have fun with, because generally speaking, dystopians tend to be pretty doom and gloom for obvious reasons. I mean, it's in the name of the genre. Even slipping in little things like where the extremist faction actually has their own goal, but is masking it under the guise of an ideology that's noble. We see this all the time in the real world. Very extreme groups that just want power, but pretend to be virtuous on the surface in an attempt to get it, while doing horrific acts the whole way through. I wanted to talk about the show because I feel like the show has a reputation for just being kind of goofy and fan servicey and over the top, but I think it does a lot of things really well. And that's part of the reason that the story actually works, because the characters take the show seriously, because the writing on a fundamental level is well constructed, the story and characters are well written, and I was pleasantly surprised by it. I'd love to read the books if I actually get some time. I think I've got about 15 books on my Kindle that I haven't touched yet, but I think this series would be worth the read. So I'm going to leave it there for this one. If you haven't seen the show, it's only 12 episodes. You can crank through it in an afternoon. I think it's worth it. If you have seen it, let me know what you think. I try to respond to comments that aren't just insults, like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.